Hi, everybody. I'm Randi Weingarten, for those who don't know. And yes, that is a cactus behind me. And yes, I am trying to grow cactus in New York City, where I am sitting here with my dogs who may start barking, but hopefully they will not. But that is part and parcel of what we've all gone through as we do so much work, and our homes and our work life are starting to merge or have been merging together in ways that, in big and small ways. I want to wish everybody a happy new year. Many of you joined us. We had over 30,000 people who joined us for our teletown hall on Tuesday, with SEIU, NEA, and ASME on vaccines. We are going to have another fireside chat with NEA, this time with Dr. Fauci, later in January. But today we put this second town hall on for this week because of the events that happened last week. The attempted, whether you call it an attempted coup, whether you call it an insurrection, we had this remarkable, horrible situation in Washington on January 6th that has now led to President Trump's second impeachment of his term, of his only 4 years, happened yesterday in the House of Representatives. So there's lots of things that we want to talk about tonight, but ultimately we put this together and we have three amazing speakers, one of whom may not be able to join us because, as you know, Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, after being in hiding or in lockdown with people who were not wearing masks. Some of the Republican House members decided not to wear masks. She and three other representatives have contracted COVID. And so Representative Watson Coleman is trying to get on with us, but she may not be able to at the last minute for, all the fast moving events that are happening and because, because of other things that are going on in terms of the Congress. But we have two other amazing guests with us, one of whom you know, because Sari Beth Rosenberg, who is an award-winning New York City school teacher, and the host of the Summer Zoom Teacher Series on PBS, was with us at our convention as well, talking about how to teach some of the major issues that are affecting us these days. Then we were talking about, as we will again today, no doubt, the reckoning that we've had, the reckoning with racism in this country, and the fact that huge swaths of this country do not believe that there should be equality under the law and there should be justice under the law. And that is part and parcel of what the current president has exploited and what you saw in terms of the white supremacist actions on full display on January 6th. So Sari is we really wanted someone who is used to speaking to thousands of people and also in schools right now, actually talking about how she's been teaching in the last few days, what has happened on January 6th and beyond. And then the third person we will be doing by video, and that is Anne Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize winning historian and writer. And I want to especially thank former Congressman Steve Israel for making sure that we could get to Anne. As many of you know, we have spent a lot of time talking to Tim Snyder. I handed out this book at one of our Teach conferences a few years ago. For those of you who don't have it, it is a quick read, and I would suggest one reads Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, the 20 lessons from the 20th century. And a new book that Anne Applebaum just put out on Twilight of Democracy, and one that talks about the lore of authoritarianism and why we are seeing it on full display in the United States. And I've asked her, just like I will ask Sari, some of these questions about how should we be dealing with our kids and our families and our communities about what happened this last week. Now, there's a lot that I could say about this, but I really want you to hear from Anne, and I really want you to hear from Sari about this, and I want to be able to make sure we can answer questions, about how we contextualize, how we understand, how it's not just a one-word tweet of horrible or unprecedented. This does not happen just by happenstance. It was not a random act on January 6th. People coming in to try to kill the vice president, to lynch the vice president-elect, try to shoot the Speaker of the House of Representatives, incited by a president who used the lie that many Republicans now believe, that the election was not free and fair. This does not get operationalized in a second. This is something that has now become deep-seated in the DNA of our country, and we need to understand what it is, why, and what we need to do to protect our democracy, assuming, as I assume most people on this Zoom do, believe that that our democracy is worth saving and is worth defending. And then obviously, what do we do in terms of our kids? So ultimately, last Wednesday, just on a personal basis, I stayed up very late Tuesday night to listen to the Georgia results. We spent a lot of time working to fight for new senators from Georgia. And you saw, very late Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning, the Reverend Raphael Warnock elected to the U.S. Senate, and then ultimately on Wednesday, John Ossoff elected to the U.S. Senate. So you had both this hope that there would be a legislature that would actually be able to work with the president-elect to do the bold things we needed to do to help make sure that Americans' lives were not only protected, but that we could improve the lives of Americans, as we say in the AFT, that everyone should have the freedom to thrive. It shouldn't be based upon wealth. It should be based upon opportunity and justice. And that's what we do as healthcare workers and public servants and educators all the time. And then I got on a plane early Wednesday morning because I felt the need to be in Washington with my mask and with my gloves and socially distancing. And our office is very close to the Capitol. And you could just see in real time, and we happened to have a balcony on the 11th floor, so you could just see in real time what was happening. You saw the lack of preparation, and then you saw the sirens and the mob and the breaching of the wall, and then hearing, from Twitter and from texting friends who are representatives, aides, or representatives themselves. What happened that day was alarming, unconscionable, and the fact that Mr. Trump refused to call out the National Guard, refused to do these things, on and on and on. It is unbelievable. And the difference, as many of us said, the difference between what happened last week and what Washington looked like, and I was in Washington a lot during the Black Lives Matter protests, it wasn't just the difference between summer and winter or night and day. There would never have been what was surrounding the Capitol during the Black Lives Matter protests would never have allowed protesters into that building. So why the difference? Why the kind of response to the Black Lives Matter protests and the kind of response here? That is part of the white supremacy that we are facing, and what has now become very deep-seated within this country's DNA. And that is part of what long-term, short-term and long-term, we are going to have to deal with. And as Anne Applebaum will tell you shortly in the video that I pre-recorded with her earlier today, because she is 6 hours, she's in Europe, as is Tim Schneider right now. So we pre-recorded the interview. Both she and Tim Snyder talk about how we need, for democracy to survive, we need to have it as fact-based, truth-based. There can't be an alternate reality. We can have different opinions, but not a different set of facts. And unfortunately, it wasn't simply that President Trump, in our judgment, and now based upon what you see in terms of the impeachment, enabled domestic terrorists to storm the Capitol and threaten the lives of duly elected officials. There are now over 5 people dead, including 2 members of the U.S. Capitol Police. But the situation has gotten worse, not better. And ultimately, several of those Republicans that voted for impeachment, they are patriots. I don't, there are lots of things that you may not disagree with Liz Cheney about, but what she said about defending our democracy that day is something for the history books. And ultimately, we're going to need to do 2 different things. One, you can't have reconciliation without having a responsibility being taken, and that is part and parcel of what impeachment is about for Donald Trump and for others, and what an investigation and probably a long-term commission has to be about 1/6, just like it was about 9/11. But the second thing is that there's a big agenda that President Biden is going to have to do, and some of it will actually start tonight as he is putting out his $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, an emergency rescue package that will be put out tonight as we are speaking. So let me actually just end before we play the interview with Anne Applebaum. There's lots of things that we can do, and what tonight is not really the call to action. Tonight is trying to start as educators, as healthcare practitioners, really understanding and talking to each other about this. We felt the need to have us coming together to talk about what happened and what we need to do as educators and as healthcare providers and as public servants. But here are some things that you can do this week. The Presidential Inauguration Committee is asking Americans everywhere to participate in community service and urging them to sign up to volunteer at bideninaugural.org /day of service. We'll put that up in, or I hope we'll put that up in a minute. You can go to that website to sign up for an event. That day, I'm also on the 18th, which happens to be Martin Luther King. Thank you for putting that up. For Martin Luther King Day, I'm going to be at Kean University, doing a discussion with a number of colleagues, including Newark Mayor Ras Baraka, on the importance and the need to incorporate African American history into the K-12 curriculum. That we can't have 2 sets of facts here. That there has been long-term discrimination that has been done to our Indigenous and our Black and Brown communities, and that we need to actually honor that, understand that, and create justice and a reckoning for that. We cannot erase that history, and that is part and parcel of what the racial reckoning has been in the last few months, including how we actually get justice for people for the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. The second thing that the inaugural committee is asking for is that on the 19th, they will hold a memorial for all those who have died of COVID at 5:30 Eastern Time at the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. And they're asking cities and towns around the country to join by lighting up buildings, and the AFT will light up our DC headquarters. And we invite you to do the same thing, amber light in homes and offices. And on the 20th, we're going to have a virtual inauguration watch party. And then even though we can't be together, we can at least be together that way. And so keep an eye on social media for how we do that. Obviously, we're also going to use Share My Lesson, those resources, as we have already in terms of teaching our young people. But as I said, let me actually start playing the tape of the interview with Anne Applebaum that we did earlier today. And, as I said, Anne Applebaum, who is a true expert on this topic, she's the author of Twilight of Democracy, a book that my wife, Sharon, and I are devouring. She is a staff writer for The Atlantic. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian. And in her free time, she also is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she co-directs ARENA, a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. I learn a lot from Anne, and I hope you will too.
So let's start our conversation tonight with the amazing Anne Applebaum, talking about the insurrection that happened last Wednesday. At one point or another, I think January 6th will be a date that people remember as much as 9/11 or December 7th. But let me ask you, Anne, why was the violent attack on the Capitol, which was designed in I don't think in just our opinion, but it was clearly designed to halt the official counting of the Electoral College. Why was that an attack on democracy itself?
So I think it's important to begin by understanding what exactly it was in the sense that it's wrong to describe the events that we've watched over the last week as a kind of ideological struggle. We are not watching a battle between liberalism and conservatism in the traditional sense of those words. What you saw at the Capitol was a group of people who now live in an alternate reality. There has been an epistemological break. They get their news and information from different sources. They don't trust, it's not just that they don't trust the Washington Post and the New York Times. They no longer trust Fox News. They no longer trust Republican Party electoral officials in Georgia. They no longer trust any source of news that doesn't tell them the things that they want to know. And the growth of this movement, if you can call it that, or the growth of this alternative reality, it's both a grassroots movement and it also has a manifestation in Congress. So there are now members of Congress who are effectively members of this movement, who also live in this alternate reality and encourage it and incite it, to use the word that so many people have used, and cooperated with it. And I think that in recent years, we have underrated the degree to which our democracy, like any democracy, depends upon an accepted set of truths. You don't have to all have the same opinion or the same beliefs or the same ideology, but in order to have a democratic debate, you have to agree on the same set of facts. You have to agree that the bridge is broken and it needs to be fixed, or the road has potholes and they need to be filled, and therefore the local government needs to make a decision to spend money to do that. That's the essence of how policy is made in a democracy. If you no longer have that basic agreement, if people don't agree that the bridge is broken or that there are potholes in the road, or that President Trump lost the election, then you can't have democratic debate anymore. And then you get events like the one we saw last week, where we had both grassroots people from around the country and members of Congress seeking to block the certification of the vote. So they were there to stop the vote from being certified and to prevent Joe Biden from being president.
I'm just unmuting myself. Let me ask you, because both you and Tim Schneider really focus on this issue about a common set of facts as key to as a first step to actually having a democracy. So how does and I think you've done a lot of this with your book, The Twilight of Democracy, which It's been on my bedstand, and I would encourage all of our members to read this book. But, how was Wednesday's insurrection, Wednesday's mob, Wednesday's swarming of the Capitol? When I say Wednesday, I mean 1/6. How is it the logical conclusion of Trump's actions? I mean, not logical for us, but how was it foreseeable as a conclusion of Trump's actions for the last 5 years? And as a result, why the impeachment is so necessary at this moment?
So it's important to remember how Trump got into politics. What was the first issue that he was attached to? And that issue was birtherism. And birtherism was a conspiracy theory that I have to say I underestimated at the time. I underestimated its seriousness and its importance. In retrospect, I now think it was extremely important. Because if you think about what birtherism implied, if Barack Obama was an illegitimate president, he was born in Kenya, he's not really supposed to be the president, not legally president, which is what millions of Americans believed. That meant that the entire apparatus of the state, the Congress, the courts, the White House, the police were all lying. In order for an illegitimate president to be in charge, then something had to have gone fundamentally wrong with the entire political system. The fact that, first of all, the fact that so many Americans were prepared to believe that. Secondly, the fact that Trump was the person so closely associated with that set of views. And then, of course, thirdly, the fact that he won the election were already an indication that something was badly wrong with American democracy. In other words, that there was a significant proportion of Americans who no longer accepted not just institutions of the opposite party and not just, it's not just that they disqualified their political opponents. They distanced themselves from the entire political system and found the whole thing farcical, and they began constructing something outside of it. And so in a certain sense, Trump began preparing Americans for this moment well before he became president. As president, this constant stream of lies, and including lies that he forced, really quite ordinary bureaucrats to accept. You may remember after his inauguration, when it turned out that his crowds were smaller than Obama's crowds, he insisted that his press secretary say on television that his crowds were bigger, even though we all knew, and the press secretary knew, that he was lying. He then forced the National Park Service to change records, to alter photographs, to do close-ups, to show that it was different. This was, this kind of lie is not just a normal lie. It's not an exaggeration. It's not a half-truth. It's not a white lie of the kind many politicians tell for many kinds of reasons. This was an attempt to undermine the institutions that give us everything. The Park Service itself is undermined by that. The institution of the press secretary is undermined. And throughout his presidency, institution by institution, he went through and he sought to undermine all of them. And of course, what this allowed him to do was escape accountability. If there are no newspapers telling the truth, then when they report on Trump Organization corruption, he doesn't have to be held accountable for it. If the FBI and CIA are all liars, then when they find out he's done something wrong, he doesn't have to be accountable for it. And this, of course, is exactly why impeachment is so important, and why it's so important that in some fashion he's held accountable for the events of last week, because he is going to attempt once again to get away with lying, to get away with altering the nature of the truth, and to avoid consequences. Almost everything that he's done as president has been designed to ensure that he and his family and people close to him avoid legal consequences. They avoid moral consequences. They avoid financial consequences for infractions they commit or for crimes they commit. And this has been fundamental to his presidency from the beginning. And he's been preparing his base, the same group who live in alternative reality that we were just discussing. He's been preparing them to accept this from the beginning. He's been creating a world in which he is never accountable. He is never guilty. He's never done anything wrong. He's never even done what you think he's done. He's never even done what you saw he did. You saw him do something. We saw him make the speech that incited the crowd. And the next day he said there was nothing wrong with that speech. He will continue to do this until the end of his life, because this is, this is his nature. This is his character. And of course, this is a classic authoritarian way of doing politics.
So there's so many more questions that I have to ask you, but I know we have several other speakers tonight. And I just, before I ask you this question, I just want to say thank you again. And for all of those, and I will do this over and over again, but for all of those who are watching, Anne Applebaum is 6 hours ahead of us right now, which is part of the reason why we are taping this in advance, and is really a scholar of amazing proportions on the issues of authoritarianism and communism and what has happened that creates authoritarianism. And it is something, we spent a lot of time talking about who white supremacists are and their intentions and their, and how Trump has connected to them and all of that. And I know that, so I think it's really important that today we're focused on the issues of how he has actually undermined democracy with the alternative reality. That whether, and as horrible as white supremacism is, and it is, and you see how he connected to it and connected to fear and to grievance. This is a man who would have done this regardless of issue. And I think that that's what you're also telling us in terms of what has happened in terms of our democratic institutions. The moment that those democratic institutions can be altered by someone who's in power. So the last question I have for you, after just saying how grateful we are for your learning and teaching, is we represent educators and Americans who are in communities all across the country. What should we as educators be doing in the coming days and weeks to defend democracy? Give us some advice about what we should be doing.
So thank you for that question. And let me just say thank you. I am really grateful to people who devote their lives to education. I know that it can be a difficult and thankless job. I've taught a little bit myself, and so I have some empathy with you. I have sat in front of classes and forgotten what I was meant to say, and struggled trying to reach students. And I so appreciate the work that all of you do. Helping to bring up another generation of Americans. And it's really me who should be grateful to you, for being here and not vice versa. One of the things that the last week's events has made clear is that, as I said, this is an epistemological crisis. It's also an educational crisis. And I would point to, I think, three things that it's really important for schools to do. One is to find a way to revive the idea of teaching civic education. This shouldn't be some boring, dusty subject in which we talk about, who was who on the Supreme Court. This should be a way of reminding children and young people that politics is about structuring the world that they live in. Everything that they see around them, why are things the way that they are, for better and for worse? And there are many wonderful things about our country, as well as many things to criticize. Everything that they see around them is structured by the political system, by choices that people make. Teaching people that they have a stake in it, and that politics is not just something for professionals. It's not just something a professional class does in Washington. It's something that everybody can do, whether it's local politics, whether it's community work, whether it's being involved in, your local school board or local, even the board of your apartment building. That all of that engagement, that's what makes America work. And teaching students how that works, what's the role of civil society in our political system. I mean, going back to de Tocqueville, start at the very beginning. Why was this considered such an important feature of American society, even, as far back as the early 19th century. Linking civic education to history. It's pretty clear that Americans don't know enough history. They don't know their own history. They don't know, it's not just, and they also don't know other people's history. One of the things that's very remarkable about some of the things that we've lived through in America over the last few years is how, and this is one of the subjects of my book, is how similar the things happening in America are to other places. You can compare American history to Polish history or to German history or to French history. And teaching students to be open to other people's history and understanding, how to, because again, what is history? Again, it's not a dusty thing that happened long ago. It's an explanation of why things came to be as they are. What was the world like before yesterday? Why does our capital have the architecture that it does? That's because of it's harking back to Greece and Rome. Why does it hark back to Greece and Rome? That's because the founding fathers were interested in Roman democracy. Why did that happen? You can literally look around you at the buildings and the structures of American democracy and begin a conversation about American history, but also about the history of other countries. And thirdly, I would say, and this is a kind of urgent crisis, which is the subject of critical thinking, teaching children how to understand what it is that they're reading on the internet, how to distinguish material that's more likely to be true from propaganda. What are the signs that a newspaper article has been fact-checked? How can you understand that? What is it, what are the signs that you're reading a conspiracy theory? How can you, because nowadays, how do most of us get information? It's on our phones. We get this sequence of texts about all kinds of stuff, ads for hairspray and, notes from our cousin on Facebook, and then the evening news. And there's no hierarchy. There's no sense that something is more important than something else. There's no way to tell if something is true or not. Teaching students to begin thinking their way through it, preparing them to live in this world, a world in which the hierarchies are not laid out for them, in which truth and falsehood is not explained to them, in which, authorities have been undermined, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, and in which they are going to have to find their own way in figuring out what's true and what's false. This is probably the most important and most urgent issue, not just in American education, but in American politics today. And creative thinking about how to do that, discussions about how to do that. It can be worked into classes in literature, in history, in studies, in science, in math. All the subjects, everything that we study ultimately is about trying to understand how to work out what's true and what's not. And the more we can put those lessons into education, and more that we can relate them to the information overload that surrounds us, the more likely Americans are to be successful in the future.
So making civic school, engaging kids, and involving all of us, particularly our kids, in really the muscle of critical thinking. That's
absolutely. And I'm convinced American teachers are creative enough and engaged enough to think their way through this. The problem of propaganda is not new. You can teach it in a class on Roman history. You can teach it in a class on the 1930s. You can teach it when you're talking about modern America. And getting children to understand what it is and how it works and how seductive it is, and how convincing it can be, is extremely important.
And sorry for my dogs barking, as we are all doing this.
It's the world of Zoom. It's okay.
And these things happen. Exactly. So let me just say to you, thank you so much for this. And please be safe. Feel good.
Thank you. Same to all of you. Everybody
we
stay
want
safe.
your engagement more and more. But please, thank you.
Thank you. And I want schools to go back and be open soon. So, best of luck to you all.
So, Anne Applebaum And my dogs are still barking 6 hours later. But Anne Applebaum, talked a lot about the difference between fact and propaganda. And we've talked a lot about that over the course of the last 4 years. In fact, we had an Americator not only article, but front page spread about discerning fact from fiction. And we all remember that situation that she talked about, that example from Trump's inauguration, as well as the example from birtherism. The roots, not only the roots of this, the seeds of this particular crisis with democracy. But we have a teacher, I mean, lots of teachers have been struggling for the last few days about what do we do? How do we talk about this? Just like they are the front lines of how we actually keep our kids safe, engage them, create context and understanding about that which is around us. And so we actually asked one of the people we've asked before and worked with before, who is one of our members, Sari Beth Rosenberg, who's a New York City public school teacher. I think it's a job she's held for over 18 years. And she's a member of the team that wrote the new social studies curriculum for the New York City Department of Education. And she wrote this 13-part series this spring, Teaching in the Age of Coronavirus, for PBS News Hour, which is part of our Share My Lesson collection. And I already told you she hosts the summer Zoom teacher series for PBS. And you can see her on Twitter, talking about that series. She just also had this amazing session with Fred Gutenberg, whose daughter was killed in Parkland, talking about the helpers and who the helpers are right now. So, this is the $64,000 question, Sari, and that is, I have 3 questions for you too, and then we'll open it up to our audience. So tell us a little about that day, how your students reacted, and tell us a little bit about, how they are now. Then I'm going to ask you about how you reacted and how you've responded, and then what are your plans? So those are kind of going to be my 3 questions.
Amazing. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me join this discussion. And it's just an honor, and I'm a proud member. And thank you so much for all you do for all the teachers and school staff in America. So I was basically about to grade my students' essays, and then I was just glued to the TV watching what was happening. And that evening, as like all the teachers watching and school staff, I'm in multiple group texts with teachers, social studies teachers, and we all started saying, how are we going to teach this tomorrow? It kind of dawned on me that, oh yes, this is an imperative that we discuss this and teach this. And, we didn't know how to approach it at first because it was still happening. So like smart social studies teachers, I decided along with the other teachers that we were just going to have to wake up in the morning and see what had happened. And well, democracy prevailed ultimately because the Electoral College votes were certified, as we all know. But the entire country, the world, was trying to sort out what was happening still. We didn't even have access to a lot of the video footage or other information. But here I was at 9:30 a.m. actually facing my first class. Interestingly enough, coincidentally enough, I'd taught the New York City draft riots the night before. And it was as if when I was teaching it, I knew that there was going to be a bunch, Trump was having his rally in DC at the same time that the votes were getting counted. But I thought, oh, there's no way that, history rhymes, but let's not let it rhyme this time. Sure enough, here we are. So honestly, what I did was I just started having kids share what they knew, what questions they had, how they were feeling. And right away, I realized something that I learned over and over again as a high school teacher. The kids you don't have to be so precious, especially with teenagers. They were watching it too in real time. The interesting thing is that a lot of my students, and I think other teachers who teach teenagers and middle school kids will agree, maybe even elementary, they get a lot of their news these days on TikTok. And so going back to what Anne Applebaum was saying, that, it depends on what algorithm they're in and what they're seeing, right? It's so important that we rise to the challenge and step in right away and ask them what they're hearing and then help them sort through that to get to the truth. Because we do lose a democracy when we don't have some sort of shared truth and facts. And so as I sorted through what my students were going through, here are some things that I heard them say in the chat mostly. They said they weren't surprised. They said they made a lot of references to the very different response to the peaceful Black Lives Matter protests that summer. I saw a lot of kids saying, "Miss, this was just a bunch of white supremacists gone wild." Some kids said it was Karens gone wild. I'm sure they got that from TikTok and Twitter. But right away, I realized I didn't have to be so precious with them. They were already exposed to a lot of different people trying to process it too. And that's when my work as a social studies teacher kicked in. And we started connecting it to what we'd been studying, which was Civil War, Reconstruction, the long, sad history of white supremacy in this country. And also something that I often talk to them about is it's a must read for every American, including kids, if you scaffold it right. It's Hofstadter's article, The Paranoid Style of Politics. He wrote it in 1964. And it's all about how conspiracy theories have long been a force in our political system. And so everything that's happening right now is not new, right? None of my students said, "This is not America." They instead, sadly, they said, this is America, sadly. So they were engaged, they were disappointed, but they also are hopeful. They're hopeful that we as a country can find a way to move past this once and for all. And they're looking to their teachers and they're looking to each other for ways to do that. And it's so important that we do.
So that brings us obviously to the next question, which is, what do we do? Like, how are you thinking about that engagement process? And, we just heard, both of us, we're both social studies teachers. We both think that civics is cool.
Yeah.
But how are you thinking about how you use this? Like, what's your lesson plan? What are you thinking about how we use this? What are your plans for engaging kids, say, in the next few days? What's your plan? As we're all going to start writing lesson plans.
Yeah, so we're writing it down. Okay, so let's work on my lesson plan right now, and I'm working with the very best, Randi Weingarten, veteran of the veteran social studies teachers. Well, here's my advice: if teachers haven't done this yet, and you don't have to be a social studies teacher to do this. After just processing the protests this summer, I decided to start my school year off with students reading John Lewis's final op-ed letter to Americans. And you know what? God bless forever John Lewis. He gave us a blueprint. Of course he did, right? Of course he gave us a blueprint. He gave us a blueprint for civic engagement and activism. So I had my students read that in the beginning of the year. You know what? We're reading it again. Because that's what we know as history teachers. When you read something in one context, it takes on a whole new meaning now. I think we need to return to that because I agree with what Anne Applebaum was saying and what you were also saying. We can't make students be passive recipients of civics education. We need to empower them with civics. It's not memorizing the branches and their different responsibilities. It's watching it in action. And I guess the only, I'm sure people in the chat are going to get mad. One of the only good things that Trump gave us was a renewed interest among all Americans in how government works, right? Because all the norms and institutions that I even took for granted been busted up, torn apart. And now that it's been deconstructed, it's a great opportunity for our students to start looking into how it all works. You know what's interesting? They're engaged for the first time about like things that you never thought they would be. So my first piece of advice is go back to John Lewis's letter to America. It was I wrote down, I forgot what it was called exactly, but it was his New York Times op-ed. And then I honestly am going to really change around how I teach next semester. Most likely, I don't know if the New York State Regents Board is listening, but I'm going to guess that we're not going to have a Regents exam. But you know, the Regents exam has been rewritten in a way that it actually makes sense to integrate current events and current civics into your lessons. And I said to my students today, I said, you know, next semester, we're going to be doing a lot more investigation of government, how it works, and current events, and connecting it to how we're studying history more than we have been already. And my students all really got excited in the chat. They're so hungry to learn about what's going on in government. Like Randi and I don't think that civics is cool, but our students actually are starting to think it's cool too, because they have so many questions because they're watching it all over the place. So, and I also have heard that another really cool thing to know that I learned from people who are in marketing and do focus groups with young people, and also just my own experience with young people with Gen Z, it's actually kind of a badge of honor, like a point of pride for Gen Z to have a cause that they're interested in. And so we are working with the generation, and I've taught for almost 2 decades, so this hasn't always been the case, but I find that all of my students are much more politically interested in politics, interested in activism. So this is our opportunity to take advantage of that and integrate it into our lessons. It's just such a seamless and easy way to do it.
So I just, as you were speaking, I just tweeted out John Lewis's last op-ed for everybody who is both watching and on Twitter, just so that they have it at their fingertips.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot. It's like Redeeming the Soul of America, right? Something
yeah, together. I think it's together you can redeem the soul of our nation.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Everyone needs to read it. I'm gonna read it again tonight because I kind of need to read that again.
Right, I agree with you to do the same thing. And you know what, I guess what I would do is there's a bunch of questions coming in, Sari, and so if you don't mind, you and I trying to answer those questions together. So thank you.
Yeah.
And you know, I think because I learn from you all the time. I learn from Anne, I learn from you, and I think that this is part of who teachers are. When we learn from each other, and we should actually have the freedom to teach and have the latitude to teach. We are, you know, we need that latitude to be able to teach our kids who actually over the course of the last several months really trust us, and they know and they see a lot more than we ever give them credit for, which is, I think, what you are seeing and saying.
Yeah, I agree.
And both of us, by the way, for those who don't know, both of us were, I was a high school social studies teacher in Brooklyn, New York, which I still miss to this day. But so the you know, the part of one of the questions we got, and one of my frustrations, and maybe this is something that we can actually push in terms of a rethink on standardized testing, is that standardized testing really did squeeze out social studies from the curriculum. Maybe not, the Regents has in New York American history and government, so it had to be there. But for elementary school and middle school students, it actually squeezed out social studies and civics. And the question I have for you is that I think we can envision like what it would mean to have empowering civics or learning the skills and knowledge of citizenship by actually being, by actually empowering kids and doing that. But what do we do? We can figure that out for high school students.
Yes.
How do we create the muscle? And I know neither one of us are elementary or middle school teachers, but how do we create the muscle in elementary and middle schools to have that interest that you just talked about so eloquently about your kids right now?
So I'm going to do a little plug, and I'm in New York City, and I'm sure other schools and districts across the country also have potentially a civics education program. But shout out to Jenna and Joe and Nora and everyone at the social studies team at Tweed here in New York City, and Brian as well, and all the other people I forgot to say, or we'd lose time. But there's a Civics for All curriculum, and it's K through 12. And it was written by teachers for teachers. And you heard me right, it's K through 12.
Right.
And so there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of young adult books and books for even kindergartners, first graders that are about civics. And you can bring those into the classroom when you have reading circles. I mean, here I am, a high school teacher. I don't know, is reading circles still a thing? It was when I was in elementary school in the 80s or whatever. But there's ways to do it where you find the books about someone who works in government. I know there's definitely a Ruth Bader Ginsburg book for young people. Have them read biographies about people who worked in politics or activists. There's different entry points that you can use to spark interest among young kids. And I'm sure I can't see the chat, but I bet you there's elementary school teachers in the chat with ideas. And I want to plug one other idea, and maybe the Biden administration will finally hear me saying this. But when I was not a veteran teacher yet, a rookie teacher, there was something called the Teaching American History Grant. And it was for K through 12 educators. It was a federally funded grant, not, for every state to use. And it paired cultural institutions, teaching colleges and universities, and departments of ed. And it brought professors in to talk about what they were studying and teaching on the college level. And then it helped teachers learn too. And so I think it'd be cool to revamp that, but like, hey, why don't we bring in different representatives of careers, and why don't we bring in local representatives to talk to teachers who can then talk to students about what they do? I think it's just we need to kind of revamp teacher education and how they're going to frame their curriculum, and then in turn that will reframe how they teach the students. I don't know if that answers the question, but I have a lot of ideas.
I think and what I think we're going to try to do over the course of the next few months is relaunch this kind of work to have about how we empower teachers to empower kids. And I think one of the things Anne Applebaum said at the end about not only making civics cool, and really helping to discern fact from fiction and really understanding the difference between fact and propaganda. But think about how important critical thinking is to that. And that, you can't get that. This is part of how things start coming back together again. Schools as centers of community, schools as cornerstones of democracy, having empowering kids in project-based instruction that could actually engage them in critical thinking being able to assess and discern the difference between, the falsities that we heard out of Trump's mouth over and over again, and things like that. But I think it requires a revamp that lets us have the time and to do this kind of empowering work with kids.
I agree.
Let me ask you, because you said at one point or another, and I don't want to lose it before we have to leave, because this is something that I hear Reverend Barber say over and over and over again as well. You started talking about how you were teaching about Reconstruction.
Yes.
And so, so the parallels, what are the parallels in American history between what we've just seen with these 5 years from birtherism to this insurrection, and what happened in terms of Reconstruction?
So I didn't time my lessons to align with I'm going to call it the 1-6 insurrection. Who knows how historians will eventually call it, but let's call it the 1-6 insurrection, the 1-6 white supremacist insurrection, right? So was it today? I mean, I can't keep track of time anymore, but so I recommend everyone who's watching right now, because part of being an amazing educator is always educating yourself. And I'm always reading and watching new documentaries that can help me then teach my students. So I've been watching clips of the America After the Civil War Reconstruction documentary for PBS put out a couple years ago. And we happened to get up to the part about the 1866 riots, they call them. And this was a year after the Civil War. And there were, 4 million plus freed Black people. And there were 2 attacks that were so brutal. One in New Orleans and one in Memphis. I think the Memphis one came first. The other one was in New Orleans. They're referred to as race riots, but what they were, and this is a term that I introduced to my students this week, they were a white lash. This was white supremacists attacking free Black communities in response to their newly found political, economic, and social freedom. And I highlighted the fact that, these 1866 riots led to the realization that Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction Plan was a major fail, #major fail. And it led to the writing of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So I taught about this, and it's pretty brutal, the recounting of what happened, as you can imagine. But I think it's important when we teach these subjects to our students, we're not precious with them. Because want to know what they all said to me when they watched this clip? They all said, why is this the first time I'm learning about this? This is horrible. But you know what's more horrible, they said? That I'm just learning about this. And I said, I know. And here's the thing that's really important. If you're going to teach, you have to teach the violent history to understand the fact, so people aren't shocked that there's violence in white supremacy today. But I highlighted the story of Lucy Tibbs. She was a victim of this race riot. And she bravely testified to Congress about her attack. They almost killed her. And that part, she was a part of the congressional record along with other women and men like herself. And it helped push the needle to get the 14th Amendment passed. So I think we need to have like 3/4 brutal truth and then 1/4 hopeful stories. So our kids just don't walk away and think there's no hope. My students are disappointed, but they're hopeful. And I feel like I'm doing my job right.
So I'm asked one more. I'm gonna ask all of us one more. I'm gonna ask you the question that I'm asking members all across the country, which is, if you were talking to the president-elect, who's soon to be the president, or the vice president-elect right now, since we'll get this video to them.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
If you had 30 seconds to say, or a minute to say, this is my hopes and aspirations. This is what I want to see you do and you use these 4 years to do. What would it be?
Oh, I only have 30 seconds.
Well, you have as long as you want, Sari.
Okay, so we'll be here for 4 hours, everyone. I apologize. Get your snacks. No, President, I'm going to say President Biden and Vice President Harris.
Good.
I'm just going to say it because it's happening very soon. I want to say, first of all, I really want you to continue the energy that you've been putting out there since the day that you were elected in a free and fair election, which is a message of unity and hope, but also being realistic and bringing us back to a place where we feel calm and where we feel like we can trust the government. And I think also keep continuing. So really it is keep doing what you're doing because it's working so far. I can't tell you how much my blood pressure goes down when I see Biden or Harris on my TV screen talking to the American people. And I do love that they are, just like teachers, we're leaders and they're leaders, and people are looking to them for, us to bring us back to the decorum that makes us feel safe and proud to be American. So that's what they have been doing this whole time in this lame duck period. I mean, there's got to be a new word for this time period, right? Not just lame duck. But I also really, I want them to, I love their education platform. I think that the theme in really everything is just building up our infrastructures everywhere, right? I think that from public education perspective, not only do we need to reimagine what do we mean by school? How are we assessing what kids are learning? Are we over testing and not preparing our kids for the world that we live in today, where you can Google search for things anyway? And also I really do think that I love that they want to put money back into the actual infrastructure of our public schools. Something that this COVID-19 epidemic has shown us is that because of, we haven't recovered. 2008 was a major hit on everyone, and our public school system has yet to, there's a lot of money that needs to go back into public education. And after Betsy DeVos has tried our hardest to dismantle public education, but we're still here. I think that what we need to do now is figure out how to bring back, put money into our schools so that we don't, if we do have a problem again with, God forbid we don't, we have the proper ventilation, that schools are safe, structurally already. So that I think we need to do as well. But honestly, the message is keep doing what you're doing, because I am so excited and I really hope to meet you all, and I hope to meet Dr. Jill Biden, and I promise to not nerd out too much if I get to meet you in person.
And you will, and no doubt I will say, and then as we close, this week, this administration, soon to be administration, has had more engagement on policy than, I've been an active leader for a long time now, going on 20 plus years. And this administration, I've seen more engagement than I've seen before. Today we had a meeting with the new labor, the labor secretary designate. A couple of days ago, we had a meeting with the HHS secretary designate and with the Surgeon General, and that wasn't the first meeting I had with them. It was we've had meetings with the CDC designate. We've had today, Becky Pringle and I had a meeting with Miguel Cardona about reopening schools and what that means and what we need to do. Tonight, the Biden administration, I know you only have one president at a time, but thank God somebody is actually acting like a president. And tonight he is putting out a $1.9 trillion emergency package. And already Speaker Pelosi and soon to be Leader Schumer has said they're going to work hard to get something done quickly. And this is about state and local money and vaccine money and money for schools and money for mental health services and summer services for kids and money to make sure that people know that there will be a roof over their heads and there will be paid sick leave. So this is the kind of government that's coming in, listening. We're not going to agree with everything, but listening and responding and trying to meet the need. And that gives me a lot of hope. Gives me a lot of hope that the new Georgia voted for, a reverend who is the presiding pastor at the church that Martin Luther King Sr. Preached at and was the senior preacher at, and that they voted for a Jew and an African American man in the New South. So I think your students actually may be more prescient than many of us in terms of seeing, yes, the disappointment of what has happened now, the trauma of all that we've been through, but also the hope of the future if we work together, collectively organize, and actually act for an America that meets what our aspirations and values are.
I love that. We do need to work together. And we're going to. Exactly. And it needs to be intergenerational. And one thing we talked about this summer was we talked about the need for intergenerational cooperation. And I feel really hopeful for that too. We're ready. Exactly. We're ready.
So I want to say to everybody who's here, first of all, Sari, thank you for taking us through the rest of this. We wish a lot of love and good thoughts to Bonnie Watson Coleman, yes, who is an indefatigable congressperson from, I think, CD12 in New Jersey, wanted to be with us, but couldn't at the last minute. She was going to talk to us about what happened that day and how she is. And I want to thank Anne Applebaum, and I want to thank everybody who's watching. It's been a pretty tough. It's been an unprecedented period of time in so many different ways. And what happened this week in terms of the incitement of a mob that swarms one of the most important places of our democracy, a place that had not been desecrated like that for over 100 years, place. And so there's a lot that we're rattled by. But the hope that Sari just talked about what her kids see, the hope I get from all of you, the light we see, there is light, there is hope, there is the fight to thrive, the fight to defend our democracy, the fight to be better. And ultimately, that's what next week is about, with the inauguration of a new president, President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris. Yes, we have to be vigilant about white supremacists and about the attempts to undermine our democracy, but we also have a right to be hopeful and to be joyous about what tomorrow brings. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.